My name is Matt. Really excited to be here today, and really excited to see so much energy around this path toward GraphQL and a new way of building applications. We did an event just last week in New York City, very similar to this, had a bunch of great conversations. And so I'll just say up front, our biggest goal for the day is for everyone here to meet each other and compare notes and tell stories. And we'll share some ideas and some thinking, and we're going to have a couple of folks up here who've been going down this path toward GraphQL in the organization, and they have a lot of stories to share as well. But above all, everyone here has a lot to share as much as to learn, and I'm really excited to have a chance for everybody to connect. So we've got some time during the day for that. We've got some time afterwards, and I hope that everyone leaves with a chance to feel like they've got a clearer picture of where they're going and maybe some excitement about what lies ahead. Let's make sure by starting we're all in the right room and assuring you that you're in the right room. This is taken from Google Trends showing the adoption and interest of GraphQL relative to some of the other API technologies that came before. Obviously, a very different adoption curve. And we see that in a lot of other settings. The state of JavaScript did a survey last year, I think, that showed 80-some-odd% of JavaScript developers are either using or want to learn GraphQL. Laurie Voss at NPM talks about GraphQL as being one of the must-learn technologies of 2019. I think the Node Foundation did a survey that found north of 20% of Node developers are using GraphQL today in production. So quite a bit of momentum in just the last year or two in terms of the overall technology. At Apollo, we have a bird's eye view of this by virtue of the Apollo platform, and in particular, Apollo Client, which is our open source tool for binding your user interface to the GraphQL queries that you're writing. This is the adoption of Apollo Client over the last couple years. That looks about right. So we have all the makings of a developer megatrend and a lot of excitement and energy. And I think each of us has had some experience that speaks to why this is so exciting, whether it's the promise of a better front-end development experience or fewer bytes on the wire and the efficiency of using GraphQL versus REST. But I think it goes a little bit deeper, and I want to spend just a couple minutes on the shape of what we see as a lead-in to what we want to talk about today. So here's an example of what a modern digital experience on the web might look like. And the point I want to make is, in 2019, building a great user experience means bringing a lot of data to the user screen. Just a super simple example might be drawing data from 3, 4, 5, 10 different services, APIs, capabilities that you have in your organization. And the key point here is if you don't do that, if you don't have personalization in your app, if you haven't piped in real-time pricing or inventory or whatever it might make sense in your context, you're not building what feels like a rich, modern user experience anymore. These are the table stakes for making a great application. And so, of course, the act of building just this one page, let alone an app, involves all kinds of plumbing to connect each of the different capabilities you have in your infrastructure to that particular screen. The other half of the problem is you're not writing one app, you're writing lots of apps. And those apps have to live not just on web and mobile, but a dizzying array of platforms that are starting to emerge, whether it's IoT or the watch or CarPlay, Roku, voice, I don't know, right? There seems like there's a new platform every 3 months now. And again, if you're not there, if you don't give your users a great experience in each of those settings, they're going to go somewhere else. So this challenge is, how do we ship great applications across all these platforms? And how do we do it where each of those applications has to talk to all this stuff that has the data you want to bring to the user? And, there's a lot of wires between the two is the answer today. You might think of that as like an M by N problem, right? Where as these numbers grow, the amount of plumbing we have to build as engineers grows as the square or maybe even the cube of that if you think about a layer in between for your back end, for your front end. And it's just a mess. And so when we talk about the rise of GraphQL, what we really mean and what we're seeing is the rise of the data graph. This layer, this missing piece that decouples the apps and what they need from your services and your capabilities and what they have. And it's absolutely transformative because instead of writing code, we get to define in a declarative way what those things are. The apps describe what they need. Those are GraphQL queries, right? And the services describe what they have in the form of GraphQL schemas. And what we have in the middle is this layer that functions like a marketplace, a rendezvous point, so that as a developer, I don't have to know how the sausage is getting made. I just describe what I want, and it comes to me. As a service owner, I don't have to really understand the intricacies of each product experience that someone's trying to build. I just have to describe what I can do and let the product developers draw from that in conjunction with all the other data and services and capabilities that I have. There's a lot to like about this model. It's a lot less code. We're going to see that today. So you get to market faster with a lot more product, right? Instead of building plumbing, you're doing what you actually signed up for as a product engineer. You're making great user experience, and you're just typing queries as you go. But I think there's more to it than that. A big advantage that we're finding as companies go down this path is a consistency of user experience. So I've got that web app and my mobile app and my app on my watch, and one of the things I can do with a data graph is stuff that used to live in the client that got implemented in each of Swift and Java and JavaScript now gets built once in the data graph. So localization is the same everywhere. My strings format the same way. My users don't feel a jarring shift in experience as they move from one platform to another. And I think maybe most exciting, and we'll come back to this theme over and over again, is that the data graph gives us this really deep insight into what our data is and how it's being used. And it gives us some control over that. So because we have this fine-grained understanding, because clients actually describe in precise terms what it is they're using, we have an ability to think about app development in a really different way, and we have an ability to think about our data and how we use it in a really different way. And fundamentally, this is all about the value and the accessibility of that data in our organization and how we can elevate that and how we can bring that to the entire application development process. So what I want to talk about today, and really what this whole day is about, is the journey for how you get that. How do you go from where you are today to a state where you have this data graph and you have the ability to build software in this new way? And the key part of that story is going to be about a change in perspective. It's about how teams work together. It's about a mindset that you bring to application development that's different from when you built a lot of imperative code to fetch data and manage how that lives. And I'm hoping that as you go through the day, you'll see that, and you'll be able to map your experience and where you are to these steps and to these changes that you're going to want to make and these things you're going to want to think about culturally in the organization. Technology is also a part of it. You'll need some software to do some of this too, so we'll talk about that. And whether it's the Apollo data graph platform or stuff that you're rolling your own, you'll see some of the essential elements of what make this such a compelling experience and what make this possible to roll out at scale. So let's start with the first step. The first stage of getting to a data graph, in my mind, is about that very first screen. And really this stage, and I suspect most people here have already gone through part of this, at least, is about not just learning the technology, but it's about having that first experience where you can query your own data and where your own data can be brought onto a screen by way of GraphQL. How many people have seen that and have seen what that's like? It's absolutely magical, right? It's once you've seen it, you never want to go back. So if you're just getting your feet wet with GraphQL, what we recommend time and again is find the quickest, shortest path to that experience. It can be an admin page on an app. It can be one of those features that maybe isn't the most critical part of your app, but often has some of the gnarliest data fetching code underneath it because it brings together a lot of different data. Whatever it is for you, as soon as you're able to render that on the screen with GraphQL, you'll start to see that value. But it's more than queries. Something we want to show you today is it's about the end-to-end development experience. It's about having three things that work together, right? A component framework, something like React, a data library like Apollo, and a strong type system that sits underneath that. And the three of those working together is an absolutely game-changing way to build modern products. We're going to get you out of the writing Redux, what are they called, reducers business, whatever they are this year, and we're going to get to a place where you're typing queries, you're defining components, and the systems are working for you. React to manage how your screen redraws, Apollo to manage how that data moves from the cloud into your client, and TypeScript to manage correctness and compatibility across all those pieces from development time through runtime. And it goes beyond the parts that live in your app. It's also the tools you use to build your app. So for example, imagine an editor that's connected to your data graph so that when a field in your graph is deprecated, you know about it as an app developer right away on your screen. Or as you type a GraphQL query, the editor can tell you in real time what the cost of adding that field to the query might be in terms of performance or latency, right? That's the development experience that you want to have at the end of that first stage. You want to see what that feels like all wired up end to end so that you can see the benefit that you'll get from an app dev perspective as you go down this path. And Danielle Mann, who runs our product team at Apollo, and we live and breathe this stuff every day, is going to walk through some of what that looks like from a developer's perspective and show you what we mean by that. Okay, if that's the first stage, the second stage is putting your key product onto a data graph. This stage is all about establishing the patterns and the workflows that you're going to use to design and operate that graph, right? And the big prize when you do that is starting to consolidate and even eliminate that plumbing that used to have to be written by hand to get data between the different parts of your application. The good news is we know how to do this now. So we've worked with hundreds of companies that have gone down this path. And what have emerged over the last year or so are a set of clear best practices for how to architect a graph the right way and how to go from a first app to a second app to a whole family of apps in an incremental and agile fashion. So you're going to live and breathe this stuff. This all comes from Principled GraphQL, a set of guidelines that we wrote. You can see that online at principledgraphql.com. I'm not going to go through each of these in particular, but the point is a lot of these answers have really emerged as clear, correct patterns that help teams get to production quickly and with confidence. And these are the sorts of things that you'll establish as part of this stage, as part of building out that first schema and moving that first app over to the data graph. What we recommend is what I call a product-first approach to doing this. And in a product-first approach, your North Star is your actual application screen. And you're going to design what the graph provides, and from there, how the schema is structured, and from there, how you implement that in terms of resolvers and the connections to your services. So you're always starting from the perspective of the app, or really from the user or the customer, right? That pattern works really well because it keeps everything nicely aligned to the actual needs of the product development org. And for example, by starting with our app and going this direction, it encourages us to keep our data graph implementation as a separate decoupled layer from our services. That turns out to be really important. It keeps our schema product-centric and modeled after what appears on the screen rather than being modeled on what you might start from with your services. And it really forces us to adopt an agile development process because what we're going to do is continually refine and evolve that work as we bring more screens and more applications into the picture. You're going to hear from SurveyMonkey later today. They've gone down this exact path, and they're going to talk about what it meant to bring more and more of the key parts of the SurveyMonkey product family onto a data graph and how they were able to do that step by step. You're going to need some tools to do this. So one example of a best practice that emerges in this pattern is the ability to evolve the graph in an agile way. This is an example of what we call schema change validation. And the idea here is that if I'm going to change the structure of my graph as I learn more and as I bring more products into the picture, I need a way to do that safely. I need a way to be able to change the definition of the graph knowing that it doesn't have some adverse effect on a particular UI component that's currently querying the graph. What's really cool about GraphQL is that we have that fine-grained knowledge of the client's requirements. I mentioned that earlier. And so an example of how that's helpful here is we can use that information to, at build time, cross-check a proposed change to the data graph against all the observed uses of the graph in production. And that's an algebra we can do statically, right? We can take a given query shape and cross-check it against a particular change to a field and either know that it's safe or know that it may cause a breaking change and identify the client that may be broken. And it's not just obvious stuff like don't remove a field that's being used. There's actually a lot of subtlety to this. So this is taken from the specification for how that particular stuff works. And there's some cases here, for example, around changing the requirements of input types or how an enum is defined or whatnot. So the point is the tooling can work for you. And as you adopt data graph, that tooling can work for you earlier and earlier in the development cycle. Another example of tooling and infrastructure is on the operational side. One of the best practices we recommend is in production, the idea of a safe list. So rather than expose your GraphQL schema to the world at large, we're going to register queries at build time, and the GraphQL layer in production is only going to answer queries that we know were written by trusted developers in the organization, right? So there's a set of things like that, again, all backed by these practices that we've learned and now documented that help you walk down that path. There is another way to do it. The other approach is what we might call a data-first approach, where we let the service capabilities bubble up into a data graph and then into a product. This is definitely a riskier approach. We have seen a lot of companies go down this path and discover that it doesn't end up giving them some of the development benefits that they were expecting. And it's because what they end up with in the data graph isn't quite aligned with what the product engineering teams really need to be able to build products faster. So my recommendations, if you're considering this approach, are these. Number one, this is really done best if you have an organization that already has an API team, maybe a backend for a front-end team, a team that's already used to managing product infrastructure. That ends up being culturally really important. Two, have a use case in mind. It's important not to design a graph in isolation as sort of a data modeling exercise before you bring the first use case into the picture. I would have that use case in the room as you do this. And third, there's a lot of sharp edges here, so find other teams that have gone down this path. Talk to us at Apollo. Find some advice that helps you really dive into what you're planning on doing and making sure that you can gain the benefits. But if you do go down this path, there can be some really big wins because it can be a very quick way to get a graph that isn't just for one product, but that allows you to transition a whole part of your business over to data graph very quickly. And that's really the third stage. So first stage is kicking the tires and getting a sense of the development experience. Second stage, getting that key product onto the data graph. If you're a fan of the Apollo program, the third stage is the going to the moon stage, right? So the third stage is about one graph for your org. And this is where we make a really big cultural shift from a graph that was really written by and for a particular product to a graph that is a shared asset across the organization, right? Something that powers all the products, all the different use cases that need this sort of data. And in this stage, you see extraordinary benefits because now we can leverage that graph over and again with each new product feature that we want to put into production. So there's benefits to velocity, there's benefits, as I said earlier, to product consistency across that stuff. This is the really big prize. And the challenge here is about how do you manage that shared asset? Because the graph is going to have a really strong network effect, right? You might start small, but there's going to be this insatiable desire to add just enough more to the schema to support that adjacent application. Maybe you start with your web app, but then you bring in your iOS application. And maybe that iOS application needs one more service as part of the graph because it's talking to a mobile analytics system that you've built. And maybe adding that service unlocks the door for a different iOS app that you have in the organization. And that might drive the need to integrate with yet another capability in the cloud. And this keeps going and going until you end up with something that's far bigger than the needs of any one particular app, right? This is a single asset for the org. And with that comes a real challenge, quite frankly, in terms of how you're going to build and maintain and operate something that doesn't fit into any one team's particular domain. This is the path Expedia went down. And you're going to hear later today about their experience building out a layer that really is the foundation for the whole travel experience across multiple products and multiple services that supply that data that makes a modern product experience across those platforms. And what you're going to hear is there's kind of two pieces to the puzzle. A lot of it is cultural. A lot of it is about ownership and how you divide up the work. Another lens you can use is it's a technical puzzle. How do you avoid having one big monolithic graph? How do you build something that you can divide responsibility for across multiple teams and have the right domain experts for each part of the graph responsible for that part of the graph? So something we're really excited about and we want to talk to you about today is called Apollo Federation. And this is something we've been working on closely with Expedia as well as companies like New York Times, Airbnb, on a technical architecture that lets you have the best of both worlds. A single graph for your org, but where the implementation is federated across multiple systems. And it looks something like this. We're going to take that data graph layer that sits between your capabilities and your apps. We're going to divide it into two parts. Part of it is going to be what we might call a gateway, a piece of shared infrastructure that presents a complete graph. That's where the clients are going to query. That's what's going to execute your GraphQL queries, right? It's also where you're going to centralize the management and the control over the graph. So questions like, where does the safe list live? How do I access the history of the schema, for example? The second layer is going to be where the actual definition of the graph lives. And instead of one monolithic schema, now that layer is going to be an array of schemas that compose together into a single graph. And in this model, each schema lives with the team that's responsible for that part of the domain model or that part of the graph. So you might have a product team that owns the product catalog, an accounts team that owns user accounts, a reviews team that owns reviews written by users. Each of these teams may be working in a different language. They have a different development life cycle. They may be using a different CI/CD system. But with the right infrastructure, we can bring all that back together into a single data graph. And there's a third piece to the puzzle, and this is where having a data graph platform comes in. It's great that we have a shared asset, and it's great that we've divided responsibilities, but things need owners. You're going to need a graph owner or a graph architect that has an overall responsibility for the shape and the health of that graph. And so alongside separate services and a piece of infrastructure you can rely on, you're going to want tooling and infrastructure that manages the life cycle of the data graph and how that changes over time. So for example, a key workflow in this model is what happens when the team that owns the reviews schema makes a change. Well, we want to do really the same thing that we saw earlier with the schema change validation, right? We want to be able to take that new change from the reviews team, compose it with what we have from the other teams, validate that that's compatible with all the different use cases of the overall data graph, and if so, do a managed rollout of that change to the gateway and thus to all the applications. Right? On the other hand, if a product team tries to push a change that doesn't end up being compatible with all the use cases of the graph, we want to stop that as part of the continuous delivery pipeline. So there's a set of workflows and tools that allow you to scale this so that there is this independent development velocity that each team can adopt, but that again, comes together into a single data graph that the whole organization can use and leverage. James Baxley is going to come up a little bit later and do a demo of that. Ask him lots of questions. He's got time for that in his talk. What I showed you earlier, this technology for having a gateway, for executing queries, for defining microservices and so on, all of this is MIT code that we're releasing in just about a week. But we're happy to give everybody an early look. Drop us a line or come find any of us during the day, and we'll get you set up. We're really excited about this, and I think you're going to find it super cool stuff. One more thing. Now that we've got this whole graph, there's a fourth and final stage in my mind. And this is a little bit further future looking, but I think it's valuable to think in terms of where this asset can take us once we've gotten to the point where we really have modeled our data and we've made it accessible to all these different use cases. I think about this as running the business on the data graph, and some examples of what people are doing today that I think over time we'll be able to formalize and we'll be able to bring more and more product and infrastructure support to are ideas like public and partner APIs. So if I want a partner ecosystem, if I really want to be a platform and not just a company with apps, maybe the data graph is the most effective way to do that, because I don't want to mandate exactly how my partners get to use my data. I don't want them to have to consume that data through these point-to-point APIs or through really heavy REST payloads that give them all the data at once. I actually want all that fine-grained knowledge of what my partners are doing just as much as I want it for my own developers, right? So public and partner APIs are one direction you can take this. Another direction you can go is, what about interactive use of the graph? What about, instead of having to build a bunch of custom line of business apps internally for my support team, what if my support team, when they're trying to resolve a billing question from a customer, can just go into the graph and execute a pre-authored query that someone's written and registered into a system? Doesn't that replace a lot of that software we had to write before? Or what if I have batch processes or scripts that I can run not against these custom APIs or directly against services, which causes this tight coupling, but rather against the graph, right? And we have companies that are starting to explore that. And finally, think about a world with GDPR or California's Consumer Privacy Act. Governments are starting to take an interest in how we manage our data. And I think rightly so, consumers are starting to expect companies to have a pretty principled approach to where that data lives and a really clear understanding of where it did and did not go. And I think the data graph really speaks to that in a thoughtful way. Because again, I have this fine-grained understanding. I can ask that question of the graph, and I can know precisely where a particular piece of privacy-sensitive information, right, may have gone, or I can enforce rules that prevent that data from leaving the organization at the data graph level, and know that every application, no matter who's writing it or how they're writing it, will follow that policy. So whether it's governance, whether it's using the metadata about how the graph is used for business intelligence, or any of these other use cases, I think what we're going to see over the coming year is more and more interest in the value of my graph, not just in connecting my apps to my data, but in understanding how those connections work and having a say in what the policy for those connections may be. So those are the stages. That's what we want you to go through today. And as you hear James and Danielle, as you hear from Expedia and SurveyMonkey, think about where are we, where can we go next, what do we need to get there, how do we get that, and I hope you'll find it's a productive and enjoyable afternoon. So thank you.